There is a universe older than memory, shaped by forces even the gods cannot fully explain. It began softly, in silence, long before names existed for what moved gently within it. Within that silence, a story took hold, told across decades, carried in the hearts of millions, and given life by one man's imagination. It is a story about strength, about family, and about what it means to keep reaching upward, even when the sky has no visible ceiling. Tonight, we follow that story from its very first breath to its most distant and peaceful ending. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. And when the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll be giving away a Goku figure. To enter, just subscribe and leave a comment on the pinned post on the channel. The link is in the description. And as the vast ancient architecture of all creation first took shape, there existed, before any warrior ever drew breath or any wish was ever spoken beneath a sky full of stars, a layered hierarchy of divine power so deep and so carefully ordered that even the mightiest fighters of any age would look upon it and feel the full and quiet weight of their own smallness. At the absolute summit of all things sat a being known simply as Zeno, the Omni-King, revered across every corner of the 12 existing universes as the one authority from which no appeal could ever be made. He was not a warrior in any sense that mortals understood, and he carried no weapon that any eye, however sharp, could ever recognize. His power was the power of conclusion itself. Whatever existed beneath his attention could be undone with the casual ease of a thought dissolving in the morning air. Before the events of Dragon Ball's main story had even begun to gather, Zeno had already demonstrated this truth in a way that left a permanent, wordless mark on the entire shape of reality. He had erased 6 entire universes, universes 13 through 18, simply because his mood had darkened on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon. Each of those 6 universes had contained its own planets, its own civilizations, its own histories stretching back beyond any horizon of recorded time. And then, just like that, they were simply gone. It is the kind of fact that sits very quietly in the mind, like a stone dropped into still water, sending its gentle rings outward across everything you thought you understood about permanence. Zeno was served faithfully by 2 attendants, the Grand Minister and the angels assigned to each universe, all of whom moved through their duties with the calm efficiency of those who had long since made peace with the nature of absolute authority. The gods of destruction, 12 in total, 1 for each surviving universe, worked beneath the angels and beside the supreme Kais, balancing creation and erasure in the careful rhythm that kept existence from collapsing in on itself. These gods of destruction were not born evil, nor were they born kind. They simply were what they were, forces as natural to the cosmos as gravity or the turning of seasons. Each god of destruction was paired with an angel attendant who served both as guide and teacher, ensuring that the balance between creation and destruction never tilted so far in one direction that the whole arrangement came undone. The angels themselves were something stranger still, beings who had existed since before recorded time, whose loyalty extended not to any universe in particular, but to the Grand Minister, and through him, to Zeno himself. And before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe for more calm Dragon Ball stories. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. In Universe 7, the universe where every Dragon Ball story would eventually unfold, the god of destruction carried the name Beerus. He was a figure of enormous power and considerably unpredictable temperament, known across divine circles for napping for decades at a time aboard a distant planet shaped like a cat's head. His attendant was a being named Whis, calm, patient, and something close to immovable in his quiet authority, who prepared Beerus his meals and waited, with perfect stillness, for his lord to wake. Between them existed a relationship that was difficult to categorize, built on years of routine that had long since outpaced any formal definition. Beerus had, at some point in the deep past, made a decision that would echo across centuries and touch the lives of nearly every character in the Dragon Ball story. He had argued with the Elder Supreme Kai of Universe 7, a being ancient even by divine standards, and as a consequence of that argument, had sealed the old Kai inside a sacred sword known as the Z-Sword. The Z-Sword would sit, embedded in a stone, on the sacred world of the Kai, undisturbed and seemingly indestructible, for generation after generation. That sealed old Kai carried within him an ability to unlock potential that no training in the world could replicate, and his imprisonment meant that ability would lie dormant for a very long time indeed. The Supreme Kais themselves were beings chosen from a race called the Shin Jin, selected by higher powers to oversee creation in their assigned universes and to keep life growing and spreading across the galaxies. They were thoughtful beings by nature, cautious and deliberate, given to contemplation rather than conflict. But contemplation, however deep, had not always been enough to keep the forces of destruction at bay. Long before the age of Goku, before any Saiyan had heard the name Frieza, before the Earth had ever learned to tremble, the universe had already faced something very close to annihilation. A being called Morrow had threatened Universe 7 with a hunger that devoured planets and drained life from the cosmos, like water running from a cracked vessel. It took the combined effort of the Grand Supreme Kai to subdue him, costing that Kai an enormous portion of their own divine power in the process. Morrow was sealed away, but the memory of what he had done settled over the Supreme Kais like a shadow that never quite lifted. There was, in this ancient period, another thread worth following, one that moved quietly through the divine hierarchy and touched the structure of existence in ways that would not fully reveal themselves for millions of years. A being referenced in certain deep lore sources as a supreme power beyond the gods had, it seemed, been involved in the construction of the multiverse itself. Whether or not this being would return was a question the angels did not discuss openly. The Grand Minister had his council, Zeno had his Grand Priest, and the 12 universes continued turning, each tended by its god and its Kai and its angel, each holding within it the seeds of futures that had not yet been dreamed. Far beneath the divine and the ancient biological history of Universe 7, there lived a race called the Majin, formless, elastic creatures of enormous and unpredictable power who operated outside the standard order of the cosmos. The most significant of these creatures was a being created not by accident, but by design, fashioned by a traveling sorcerer named BBD, who believed that power, however monstrous, could be controlled if only the right vessel were constructed. This creation was called Majin Buu, and from the first moment of his existence, he was something the universe had never quite seen before. Majin Buu, in his original and purest state, was a being of boundless destructive energy, roaming freely and consuming planets with the casual hunger of something that had never been taught the meaning of consequence. He destroyed civilizations across Universe 7. He killed 4 of the 5 Supreme Kais who tried to oppose him, each of those Kais carrying within them enormous reserves of sacred power that vanished from the universe with their deaths. 2 of the surviving Kais he absorbed rather than killed, and through that absorption something unexpected occurred. The creature that had existed as pure violence began, very slowly, to soften. Traces of goodness, buried deep, began to alter the way Buu perceived the world around him. He did not become gentle overnight. He did not become kind in any way that a mortal might recognize. But something shifted. Something small, difficult to name, but real. The 5th Supreme Kai, the East Supreme Kai, whose name in later years would become Shin, managed to survive by facing BBD rather than Buu directly. Shin killed BBD before the sorcerer could complete his plans, and with the sorcerer gone, Buu's shell fell dormant on the planet Earth, sealed in a magical egg, left behind like a period at the end of a very long and very terrible sentence. The universe breathed, if the universe could be said to breathe, with something like relief. The Supreme Kai, who remained, watched over his assigned galaxies with the quiet vigilance of someone who knew that sealed things did not always stay that way forever. Long before Buu had been created, and long before BBD had first spoken his intentions aloud in whatever dark corner of the universe he had occupied, there was a Saiyan unlike any other. His name was Yamoshi, and the story told about him was so old and so overlaid with myth that separating what was true from what had become legend required a certain willingness to sit with uncertainty. What the records agreed upon was this: Yamoshi was a Saiyan with a righteous heart, and he was the first of his kind to achieve a transformation so profound it seemed to transcend the physical entirely. He became, in that ancient time, the original Super Saiyan, and beyond that, with the assistance of 5 other Saiyans who lent him their energy, he achieved something that would later be called the Super Saiyan God. The power released in that transformation was extraordinary, but Yamoshi was outnumbered, and in the end, the weight of the opposition that surrounded him proved too great. He was defeated. His body was lost to history. His spirit, however, persisted, wandering through the cosmos, searching across eons for a successor worthy enough to carry what he had carried. That search would last for countless generations, spanning the full rise and fall of civilizations, outlasting empires and ice ages and the slow migration of stars. Yamoshi himself would not find his successor for an almost incomprehensible stretch of time. But the myth of the Super Saiyan God spread, carried in whispers through Saiyan oral tradition, changing shape with each retelling, losing detail and gaining legend, until it was more feeling than fact. A golden story told to Saiyan children on cold nights about a warrior whose power had once set the stars themselves trembling. The Saiyan race was, at its core, a warrior people, proud, fierce, defined entirely by the measurement of their own strength and the strength of those around them. They came from a planet that would eventually bear the name of their king, but in the earliest days of their history, they had shared that world with another civilization entirely. The Tuffles were a race of small, physically unimpressive people who had compensated for their lack of physical power with extraordinary technological sophistication. Their cities were marvels of engineering. Their weapons and detection devices operated on levels of complexity that the Saiyans, with their blunt and direct approach to most problems, had never felt compelled to develop independently. For 10 long years, the Saiyans and the Tuffles waged a war across that shared planet, a conflict that stretched through seasons and setbacks and moments of apparent stalemate before finally tilting decisively in one direction. The Saiyans possessed something the Tuffles had no technological answer for. On nights when the moon hung full and visible above the battlefield, every Saiyan fighter who looked upon it transformed, their bodies expanding beyond normal dimension, their consciousness retreating, the creature that emerged wearing only the loosest connection to the person who had stood there moments before. The Tuffles had built walls and weapons and scanners. They had not built anything that could stop an army of enormous rampaging great apes descending on their cities under moonlight. The Tuffle King, in his final hours, made a decision that would cast a very long shadow across the future. He took his own genetic material, the memories, the intelligence, the pride of his vanishing civilization, and encoded it into a parasitic organism that he launched into space, hoping that whatever it eventually found, wherever it eventually landed, it would carry the Tuffle legacy forward into a future he would not live to see. Then his civilization fell, and the planet was renamed Vegeta, and the Saiyans stood alone on the world they had taken by force. It was not long after this, in the broader scale of cosmic history, barely a breath, that a figure arrived at planet Vegeta who would change the entire trajectory of the Saiyan story. King Cold was a being of enormous physical power and considerable political cunning, who had built an empire that stretched across a significant portion of the known universe. His method was simple and efficient. He found civilizations with power he could use, and he folded them into his operation. The Saiyans, with their warrior culture and their natural combat ability, were precisely the kind of resource his empire needed. He arrived to make an announcement. He was retiring from the direct management of his conquering operations, and his son, a being who carried cold authority in every line of his posture, would be taking command of the Saiyan forces. That son's name was Frieza. King Cold departed, and Frieza, who had inherited every gram of his father's ambition and added considerable layers of his own, turned his attention to the planet and the people that had just been handed to him. The Saiyans continued their work under Frieza's command, traveling to planets designated for conquest and clearing them for sale to the highest bidder. They were good at their work, frightening by nature, effective by training, their power levels sufficient for most of what Frieza required of them. But Frieza was not easy in his mind about the arrangement. He had access to prophecy, or something close enough to it, and what that prophecy told him about the Saiyan race kept turning over in his thoughts during the quiet hours. There existed, the old stories said, a legend among the Saiyans, a myth of a warrior who would rise from their number and achieve a power that even gods might struggle to stand against. The Super Saiyan prophecy, as Frieza understood it, was not a certainty, but Frieza did not deal comfortably in uncertainty when the stakes were this high. He watched the Saiyan King. He watched the numbers. He watched the birth rates and the power levels of newborns, and he calculated, with the cold precision of someone who had long since stopped pretending that sentiment had any place in his decision-making. In a medical pod somewhere within the technological infrastructure of planet Vegeta, a Saiyan infant was born and his power level was immediately measured. The result was extraordinary, so extraordinary that it disturbed the individuals who recorded it. The child's name was Broly, and the power dormant within him was not merely high for a newborn Saiyan. It was higher than the king. It was higher by a margin that seemed almost impossible to credit than nearly any Saiyan ever recorded. King Vegeta reviewed the data and made a quick, uncomfortable decision. The child was a threat, not to any enemy, but to the political and personal authority of the Saiyan royal line. Broly was placed in an escape pod and launched toward a remote and inhospitable planet called Vampa. His father, Paragus, driven by love or desperation or both, followed his son into space in a separate vessel and eventually found him. That same year, another infant was born into the Saiyan community, a boy whose power level, by the standard measurement, registered as low. He would be assigned to a distant planet for a standard conquest mission, as was the custom for Saiyan children who showed little early promise. His name at birth was Kakarot. He was the second son of a Saiyan warrior named Bardock and a woman named Jine, who was unusual among Saiyans in that she had stepped away from the warrior life and worked instead in the food distribution center at the Saiyan base. Jin was gentle in a way that most Saiyans did not particularly value, and Bardock, who had earned his reputation through decades of brutal effectiveness in the field, had remained at her side in a bond that most of his comrades found puzzling and somewhat sentimental. Bardock was a warrior of considerable ability and somewhat unusual depth for his people. He had, over the years of his service to Frieza's empire, accumulated enough experience to recognize certain patterns, the subtle signals of an operation changing shape in ways that those at the bottom of the hierarchy were not supposed to notice. When he overheard conversations suggesting that Frieza was planning something final for the Saiyan race, the information landed in him differently than most threats. This was not a battle he could win through training harder or powering up further. This was something political and cold, and already decided before he had even begun to understand the question. Bardock made a choice. He and Gina had already been watching over their infant son Kakarot, with an attachment that was, for Saiyans, somewhat uncommon. Now, with Frieza's intentions becoming clearer through the intelligence Bardock had gathered, they made the decision to send the child away. They placed him in an escape pod, small and unimpressive looking, capable of automated navigation to a distant, quiet planet, and they set the coordinates for a world called Earth. It was a planet with a low-level warrior population, far enough from Frieza's primary operations that no one would have any particular reason to look for a low-power Saiyan infant there. The capsule launched, and Bardock, having done what he could for his youngest son, turned back to face the crisis that was already closing around him. He mounted something that could be called a resistance, standing alone against the forces Frieza sent against his own people, fighting with the kind of fury that comes not from tactical confidence, but from the refusal to surrender to something that was wrong. Frieza ended it personally. He gathered his power, shaped it into something apocalyptic, and released it against planet Vegeta with a force that left nothing standing. The planet imploded. The Saiyan race was nearly entirely destroyed in those few moments, leaving only a handful of survivors scattered across the galaxy. Frieza's own elite soldiers, kept alive because they were useful, unaware that their usefulness had an expiration date. The official story, spread throughout Frieza's empire in the aftermath, was that a meteor strike had destroyed planet Vegeta. It was the kind of lie that required no particular effort to maintain, because most of those who might have contradicted it were no longer alive to do so. The Saiyan race that had once filled an entire planet with its warrior culture was reduced to a few individuals whose survival depended entirely on remaining useful to the man who had killed them. On the planet Earth, a small capsule descended through the atmosphere and came to rest in a quiet, rural region far from any populated center. Inside was an infant who had been crying steadily for the duration of the journey, and who was still crying when the pod's hatch opened and let in the cool air of a world that smelled nothing like home. A man found the pod, an elderly martial artist named Gohan, who had chosen years ago to live simply and alone in the mountains, training his body and cultivating a philosophy of strength in service of kindness. Gohan took the child home with him. He named him Son Goku. He observed, in those early days, that the child was almost preternaturally aggressive, not in a way that suggested malice, but in a way that suggested something fundamental to the creature's nature. Whatever instinct drove him to fight and to push and to resist was very close to the surface. And then, at some point in early childhood, there was a fall. The child tumbled into a deep ravine and sustained a serious head injury. When he recovered, he was different. The aggression had receded. In its place was something more open, curiosity, warmth, a kind of guileless happiness that would define him for the rest of his life. Grandpa Gohan taught the boy martial arts. He passed along the techniques he had learned from his own teacher, Master Roshi, pressing them into Goku's body through years of patient repetition. But more than the techniques, Gohan gave the child something harder to name, a way of moving through the world that valued kindness as much as strength, that saw compassion not as weakness, but as the thing that made strength worth having. Goku absorbed these lessons with an ease that was almost effortless, because the heart beneath them, the honest, generous, uncomplicated nature that had somehow survived the Saiyan genetic inheritance, was perfectly suited to receive them. They lived together quietly in those mountains, Grandpa Gohan and the boy he had raised as his own. There was one rule that Gohan maintained with particular firmness. Goku was not to look at the full moon. The old man had seen what happened on those nights, and he understood the danger with a clarity born from having witnessed it himself. Goku, in the way of children, did not always remember the rule. One night the moon was full and Goku looked up. What followed could not be undone. The transformation overtook him, his body swelling, his consciousness retreating behind something ancient and enormous and wild. And by the time the moon set and the boy came back to himself, Grandpa Gohan was gone. Goku did not understand what had happened. He continued living in the mountains as he had always lived, training each morning, gathering food, protecting the 4-star Dragon Ball that his grandfather had given him, the one memento that remained, a small orange sphere with 4 red stars inside it that he treated with the careful reverence of someone who understood that certain things, once lost, could not be recovered. He kept that quiet life until the day a blue-haired girl arrived in the mountains, on a small vehicle holding a device that pointed at the 4-star ball and registered something like recognition. Her name was Bulma, and she was 14 years old, and she had built the device herself. Bulma was the daughter of one of the most accomplished scientists on Earth, a man named Dr. Brief, whose corporation had built a significant portion of the technology that the modern world used. Without thinking twice, she had grown up surrounded by genius and by the expectation that genius was the baseline, not the exception. At the age when most children were still figuring out simple mathematics, she had already begun constructing devices that her teachers could not fully evaluate. The device she carried into those mountains, a radar designed to locate a set of mysterious spheres called Dragon Balls, was the product of her own research, her own engineering. and a particular kind of restless ambition that drove her toward impossible projects the way some people are driven toward impossible mountains. The Dragon Balls, as Bulma understood them, were 7 magical spheres scattered across the earth. When gathered together, they summoned a dragon, a vast ancient creature named Shenron, who could grant a single wish to whoever had collected all 7. The wish could be almost anything. The legends around the Dragon Balls were very old, and most people on Earth did not believe they were real. Bulma, who had a scientist's relationship with disbelief, had constructed her radar first and intended to decide on the question of reality once she had evidence in front of her. Goku's encounter with Bulma was the beginning of everything. He had never seen anyone like her, had never in fact seen many people at all, having grown up in the wilderness with no neighbors and no framework for understanding how the wider world operated. He was also at this point the strongest fighter on Earth, by a margin so large that the comparison was almost meaningless, though he had no particular way of knowing this, because he had no one to compare himself against. The two of them set off together to find the remaining Dragon Balls, and what followed was the kind of adventure that can only happen to people who are entirely unprepared for one another and too stubborn to turn back. They encountered Emperor Pilaf, a small, scheming would-be conqueror who had been pursuing the Dragon Balls for his own ambitions, along with Pilaf's 2 loyal subordinates, Mai and Shu, who managed their operations with a combination of genuine competence and frequent misfortune. Pilaf captured the group. Their escape involved chaos, Moonlight, a great ape, and a final wish to the summoned dragon that was, by any measure, one of the most deflating conclusions to a grand magical summoning in recorded history. The wish was for comfortable underwear, the Dragon Balls scattered across the earth again, resetting the search. The world that Goku and Bulma had moved through during those early adventures was wide and strange and full of individuals whose lives would later become central to everything. There was Yamcha, a desert bandit of considerable combat ability who had begun that first story as an antagonist and ended it as something closer to a friend. There was Oolong, a shape-shifting creature with a persistent inability to match his ambitions with his behavior. There was Puar, a floating shape-shifting companion of Yamcha's, who was considerably more reliable than their associate. And there was a small island, and on that island, a house, and in that house a man named Master Roshi, who was both genuinely ancient and genuinely powerful, and also genuinely eccentric in ways that created complications at regular intervals. Roshi had been one of the greatest martial artists in the world for so long that the world had largely forgotten him, which suited him fine. He had trained Grandpa Gohan, he had trained others before that, reaching back further than most people's memory could follow. He possessed a technique, the Kamehameha wave, that he had spent 50 years perfecting, a focused beam of ki energy released from cupped hands, requiring total concentration and a specific gathering of internal power. It was the technique that would, in time, become the most recognizable martial arts move in all of Dragon Ball history. Roshi agreed to train Goku, and as part of that arrangement, another student joined them, a boy named Krillin, who had traveled to the island with recommendations from his old martial arts school, and a personality that combined genuine dedication with a particular gift for being at the center of whatever situation had become most complicated. Krillin and Goku were rivals immediately, and friends almost as quickly. They pushed each other in the way that only equals can push one another, and in pushing grew stronger at a rate that surprised even their teacher. The training that Roshi devised for his 2 students was unconventional in ways that continued to reveal their purpose only in retrospect. He sent them to work, delivering milk across mountainous terrain before sunrise, swimming against ocean currents in water full of hazards, tilling fields without tools while wearing heavy turtle shells on their backs. None of it was technique. All of it was foundation. By the time the 2 boys had finished their training period and arrived at the 21st World Martial Arts Tournament, they were physically transformed, carrying within their still small bodies a degree of strength and speed that bore almost no relationship to where they had started. The tournament revealed just how wide the gap between them and the general fighting world had grown. They moved through the early rounds without significant difficulty, each encountering opponents who were, by local standards, considerable fighters and dispatching them with the kind of ease that would have been humbling if Goku and Krillin had been the type to notice. Goku reached the final round. His opponent was a fighter calling himself Jackie Chun, a name that concealed, behind a false beard and thick sunglasses, their own teacher, Master Roshi, who had entered the tournament under a disguise because he had decided that neither of his students was quite ready to win yet. The final match was extraordinary by every measure available to that tournament. Goku and Roshi fought with everything they had across a match that ended not through injury, but through something considerably simpler. Goku, having leaped into the air during the final exchange, saw the full moon through a gap in the clouds, began to transform, and then woke up sometime later to find the moon gone. The match concluded, and Jackie Chun declared the winner. Roshi had destroyed the moon, quietly, without drawing attention, with the particular decisiveness of someone who understood that certain problems require complete solutions. Goku took his second-place prize with the same uncomplicated happiness he brought to everything, and the tournament concluded. The Red Ribbon Army was an organization of considerable size and considerable menace that had been operating across the Earth's surface with the single-minded purpose of collecting the Dragon Balls before anyone else could. Their resources were vast: military hardware, a network of bases, a hierarchy of commanders, each with their own particular set of capabilities and their own particular brand of ruthlessness. At the head of this organization sat a small man in a large chair, who measured success in terms of total compliance and suffered failure with a degree of personal intensity that his subordinates found clarifying. Goku encountered the Red Ribbon Army while resuming his search for the Dragon Balls, the search that had begun with Bulma and the Dragon Radar, and had been interrupted by the Pilaf situation and the subsequent events. He did not approach the army as a military strategist would approach a well-resourced enemy. He approached them the way Goku approached most obstacles, directly, honestly, and with complete confidence that if he simply moved forward and did his best, the problem would eventually resolve itself. This approach was, against the Red Ribbon Army, remarkably effective. He moved through their bases and their commanders with the steady, unhurried progress of someone who had not been told that the situation was supposed to be difficult. He defeated Colonel Silver in the northern mountains, crossed an ice field on foot, encountered a small village being terrorized by a snow person problem that turned out to be related to a Dragon Ball, and continued generally southward and eastward through whatever obstacles the army placed in his path. Each commander he encountered was more powerful than the last, and each fell. The army's hierarchy received these reports with increasing disquiet. Among the figures he encountered during this period were individuals who would leave deeper marks. Hasky, a thief employed by the army; General Blue, one of the more powerful and formidable commanders, whose psychic abilities created genuine difficulty; Mercenary Tao, a legendary assassin hired by the army after their in-house resources had proven insufficient, whose reputation was such that even skilled fighters heard his name with a degree of caution. Tao killed one of Goku's friends during their encounter, and the weight of that loss sat differently from other setbacks. Goku had encountered the irreversibility of what Tao had done. He trained, he returned, he defeated Tao with a skill that had grown in the interval between their meetings, and continued to the army's final headquarters. The headquarters fell. The army commander, whose name would later become relevant to a much more dangerous successor organization, survived the encounter but lost everything he had built. The Red Ribbon Army, for all its hardware and all its personnel, had been dismantled by a single child who had not been trying to dismantle anything, who had simply been looking for orange spheres and kept finding soldiers standing between him and the next one. The 22nd World Martial Arts Tournament came, and Goku returned to compete. He had spent the intervening years training, first with Korin, the mystical white cat who lived at the top of an impossibly tall tower, and whose training involved attempting to take a jug of sacred water from someone who would not let you have it, and then with Roshi again, and with the accumulated experience of everything the Red Ribbon Army had taught him about real combat. Krillin was there, So was Yamcha. So was Tien Shinhan. A fighter of serious ability and serious bearing, trained under a school whose methods were considerably less wholesome than Roshi's, who arrived at the tournament as something close to an antagonist and left it as something considerably more complicated. Tien's counterpart, a small round person named Chiaotzu, accompanied him everywhere with the quiet devotion of someone who understood that belonging to another person's story did not diminish the value of your own presence in it. The tournament's semifinal round produced a fight between Goku and Tien that was, by any reasonable measurement, one of the best fights that had ever been witnessed at the World Martial Arts Tournament, which was itself, by that point, the foremost competitive combat event on the planet. They were evenly matched in a way that genuine even matches almost never are, each capable of moments of surprise, each finding in the other a genuine limit to push against. Tien won by the narrowest possible margin. He had not expected to be as affected by the victory as he was. Something in the encounter had shifted his understanding of what strength was supposed to serve. The tournament's final matched Tien against Master Roshi himself, no longer in disguise. Tien won, and somewhere in the crowd, watching with the particular attention of someone in whom something was beginning to clarify, Goku made quiet notes about the distance that still remained between where he was and where he intended to eventually be. Between the tournaments, in the wider world that Dragon Ball's story moved through, a threat was assembling itself with the patient deliberateness of something that had been waiting for a very long time. King Piccolo was a name that belonged to a history most of the Earth's inhabitants had either forgotten or never known, a Namekian being, ancient beyond easy calculation, whose evil had been separated from its companion goodness at the moment of a divine crisis, long before the main story began, and who had built a small empire of chaos and violence across the planet before being sealed away in an electric rice cooker by a martial artist named Mutaito, who had given his life to complete the sealing technique. Mutaito had taught the evil containment wave, the Mafuba, to only a few students, and those students had taught it to others, and the knowledge had passed down through generations in the martial arts world with the particular weight of knowledge that carries a warning within its structure. Master Roshi knew it. It had cost his teacher's life to seal Piccolo the first time. The idea of using it again came with a very specific understanding of what it might cost. King Piccolo was freed, released from the rice cooker by a young man named Pilaf, whose ambitions had never particularly aligned with the broader welfare of civilization. Piccolo emerged from his long imprisonment with a fury that had not diminished in confinement, and a plan for revenge against the martial arts community that had produced the technique that sealed him. He sent his children to kill the martial artists who knew the evil containment wave. He killed the current great kami of Earth. He summoned Shenron and wished for his youth to be restored, and when Shenron had completed the wish, he destroyed the dragon himself, preventing any further wishes from being made. He was methodical in his evil, in a way that simple destructive power could never be. He understood that to hold power permanently, you needed to dismantle the mechanisms that might eventually be used against you. Krillin was killed during this period. The weight of that particular loss landed on Goku in a way that was different from other losses, more immediate, more personal, more directly connected to the question of what strength was actually for. He pursued King Piccolo alone, without the Dragon Balls, without backup, without any realistic assessment of his odds. He faced Piccolo directly and was beaten badly enough that survival itself was not certain. He recovered, trained with Korin again, climbed above Korin's tower to an even higher level where the divine lived in even quieter forms, and came back changed in ways that were difficult to articulate, but unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The rematch was total. Goku dismantled King Piccolo's remaining children, moved through his defenses, and eventually confronted the ancient evil directly in a fight whose outcome was determined not by a technique but by a single moment of absolute concentrated will. Goku punching through Piccolo's chest with the last reserves of his own nearly depleted power. King Piccolo, dying, released an egg containing his next incarnation, a son who would carry his genetic memory, his intelligence, and his biology, but not, as it turned out, his fundamental purpose. In the years that followed, Goku trained under the Kami of Earth, the divine guardian who was, in a biological sense, the other half of King Piccolo, the good separated from the evil at a moment of long-ago crisis. Kami's training was different from everything before it. Where Roshi had built the body and Korin had built the instincts, Kami was asking Goku to become something that went beyond the physical, to sharpen his perception, his sensitivity to ki, his ability to find stillness within movement. He spent 3 years there, on a floating platform above the clouds, training under conditions that would have broken almost anyone else in the world, and that Goku simply inhabited with his characteristic thoroughness. The 23rd World Martial Arts Tournament brought everyone back together. Krillin had been wished back to life with the Dragon Balls. The dragon had been restored after King Piccolo's defeat, since Kami was still alive and the dragon's existence was connected to his. Tien returned. Yamcha returned. And there was a new fighter in the field, a young woman named Chi-Chi, whom Goku had met years earlier during the Dragon Ball search, and to whom he had apparently made a promise without fully understanding what he was promising. Chi-Chi arrived at the tournament to remind him. The tournament's bracket produced, among other developments, Goku's encounter with a fighter calling himself Ma Jr., Piccolo Jr., the son of King Piccolo, come to fulfill his father's unfinished business. The fight between them was unlike anything the tournament had hosted before. Piccolo had trained across the same 3-year period as Goku, and the disparity between them was not large. They fought through techniques and counters and raw exchanges of power that stretched beyond what the tournament's standard framework was designed to accommodate. Piccolo achieved a giant form, growing to enormous size, expanding his arms to reach across impossible distances. Goku responded with a flight technique that Piccolo could not match. The fight concluded with Goku's victory, but the moment after the victory was more revealing than the victory itself. Goku gave Piccolo a Senzu bean, one of the magical beans that healed injuries completely, and allowed him to leave. There was something in that gesture that was neither foolishness nor naivety. It was a kind of faith, extended without guarantee, that the being who had just tried to kill him was capable of becoming something other than what his origin had made him. Piccolo left. He did not forget. Goku and Chi-Chi were married. The next phase of their lives, quiet and domestic by comparison, lasted for a few years before the world's attention was pulled upward, toward a sky it had not thought to watch. 5 years after the 23rd World Tournament, Goku was living a simpler life, married, a father to a son named Gohan, training when the opportunity arose, attending tournament gatherings with old friends. Gohan was 4 years old, named after the grandfather whose memory Goku still carried with genuine tenderness, and possessed from birth of a power that registered on any scale as anomalous. The child did not yet know what he was capable of, and the first indication came in a moment of crisis rather than training. A spaceship descended from the sky above the region where Krillin and Goku had been meeting, and from it emerged a being whose appearance resembled Goku enough to be disturbing. He called himself Raditz, and he explained, with the calm authority of someone delivering information that they expect to be unpleasant to receive, that he was Goku's older brother, that Goku was not of Earth at all, but a Saiyan, and that his mission on this planet had been conquest, not life. He was here to offer his brother a choice: rejoin the Saiyan mission or face the consequences of having spent his life defending the civilization he had been sent to destroy. Goku refused. The confrontation that followed was decisive in its difficulty. Raditz was dramatically stronger than anything Goku had encountered before. Stronger than Piccolo, stronger than the combined effort of the two of them together. The resolution came through sacrifice. Piccolo, who had been observing from a distance and who had his own reasons for being invested in Goku's survival, had been developing a new technique. The special beam cannon required enormous concentration and time to charge, and it needed a clear shot. The clear shot required someone willing to hold Raditz still long enough for Piccolo to fire. Goku held his brother. Piccolo fired. Both of them died. But Raditz, in his final moments, had transmitted enough information for those who heard it to understand what was coming. He had activated a scouter, one of the devices used to measure power levels, and the data from the encounter, including the reading on Gohan's power level when the child had broken through an otherwise unbreakable pod in a moment of blind panic, had been transmitted back towards something in space that was listening. 2 Saiyans, 3 years away, they had heard. In the world of the dead, Goku traveled along the path that souls followed after departing the living world, a road that wound through clouds toward the residence of the King of the Kais, divine beings whose authority in the realm of the living was focused on the management of their respective galaxies. The North Kai, whose planet sat at the end of a serpentine road stretching across an enormous gravitational body, offered to train him. The training took place on a planet with enormous gravity, pressing on every movement, every breath, every attempt to stand upright, until movement under normal gravity afterward felt like moving through open air after years underwater. On Earth, the 300 days before the Saiyan arrival were not wasted. Piccolo had, following the encounter with Raditz, made a decision that surprised even himself. He had taken Gohan and begun training the child. This was not, he told himself, sentiment. This was strategy. The child's power was extraordinary, and power of that order, left untrained, was simply wasted. That the training developed between them something that could be called a relationship, and that Piccolo found himself increasingly invested in the small person who looked at him with complete openness, was a development he processed privately. Yamcha, Tien, Chiaotzu, and Krillin trained under Kami's guidance. The gravity of what was coming did not permit anything less than complete dedication. They understood that the Saiyans arriving were categorically stronger than anything they had faced before, that the gap between their current capability and what they would need was significant. They trained anyway. The response to impossible odds among those who had been shaped by Goku's example was not withdrawal but preparation. The Saiyans arrived. There were 2 of them, Nappa, a large and blunt instrument of destruction who served as the physical reality of the threat, and Vegeta, the prince of the Saiyan race, whose authority over the situation was absolute and whose contempt for everyone around him was a structural feature of his personality rather than a response to any particular stimulus. They had traveled to Earth specifically to find the Dragon Balls and used them for what Saiyans understood as the obvious wish, immortality, which would allow them to fight without limit and without consequence for as long as the universe held anyone worth fighting. The battle in the field north of the city was a disaster by almost any meaningful measure. The Saiyans had planted 6 organic creatures called Saibamen, beings capable of combat at roughly Raditz's level. As a preliminary test of the Earth's defenders, Yamcha was killed by a Saibamen's suicidal explosion. The remaining fighters destroyed the Saibamen and faced Nappa directly, and what followed was a sustained encounter in which everything the Earth's warriors had prepared proved insufficient. Chiaotzu attempted a sacrificial explosion and survived only because Nappa was too powerful for the blast to matter. Tien lost an arm. Piccolo died. Gohan, who had come to the battle despite his father's wishes, witnessed the death of the person who had trained him and discovered in that moment that the line between despair and transformation was thinner than anyone had explained. Goku arrived, having been wished back to life by the Dragon Balls and transported across the Serpentine Road by a means that Bulma's support network had made possible. His strength, having grown through the North Kai's training and the particular quality of training under increased gravity, had increased to a level that placed him unambiguously above Nappa. He defeated Nappa. Nappa, having been defeated, turned toward the child who had been fighting beside him, and Vegeta, with the flat disinterest of someone filing paperwork, destroyed Nappa himself for the embarrassment of losing. Goku and Vegeta fought alone, the debris field around them clearing as the scale of their confrontation made all other presence irrelevant. This was the encounter that defined a rivalry that would last for the remainder of the Dragon Ball story, and beyond it, a rivalry built not on hatred, but on something more complicated and more durable: the endless, fundamental contest of two people whose pride and whose drive pushed them toward the same impossible ceiling from different directions. Vegeta revealed his moon-creating technique, an artificial great ball of light that triggered the Uzaru transformation without a natural moon. Both he and Goku transformed. The landscape around them stopped being a landscape and became something else entirely, a geography of destruction shaped by forces that had temporarily outgrown their containers. Gohan, who had retained his tail, caught sight of the artificial moon and transformed alongside them. The resolution of the Saiyan battle was the work of everyone remaining: Krillin, Gohan, Yajirobe cutting Vegeta's tail, Goku using the last of his power in a spirit bomb technique that the North Kai had taught him, which gathered energy from all living things willing to contribute it. Vegeta was beaten, badly. He had arrived expecting conquest and was leaving in the wreckage of it. In the final moments, Krillin held a blade that could have ended it. Goku asked him not to. There was in that request an understanding that the story was not finished, that Vegeta, who had fought with everything he had and been defeated not through any failure of will, but through the combined effort of people operating significantly beyond their expected limits, represented something worth allowing to continue. He was allowed to leave. He did not forget. The Dragon Balls had all been used in the aftermath, wishing back those who had died. But the Earth's Dragon Balls had limits. Each person could only be wished back once. Those who had died on the Saiyan battlefield needed to be wished back using another set of Dragon Balls, on another world. The trail led to Namek, the home planet of Kami, and by extension of Piccolo, a world on the far side of the galaxy where Dragon Balls existed and where the local dragon could grant 3 wishes rather than 1. But the trail also led there for someone else. Frieza had been following reports of the Dragon Balls since the incident on Earth, and the intelligence he received about Namek pointed him in the same direction. He traveled there with his most powerful elite soldiers, pursuing the same spheres for a wish whose content was, for him, identical to what the Saiyans had wanted: immortality, with which he could hold his empire against any future challenge. Divine or otherwise, Gohan, Krillin, and Bulma arrived on Namek first, moving through a planet that was quiet and very beautiful, a world of clear water and tall grass under a sky that was perpetually tinted the color of late afternoon, populated by a people called the Namekians, who had retained their connection to the spiritual and the agricultural, while their warrior lineage slept dormant in the corners of their biology. The Namekians were not soldiers. They were, in the main, gentle. They were also, as Frieza's forces began moving through their villages, entirely insufficient to defend themselves. The Ginyu Force arrived at Namek before Goku did, 5 elite warriors who served as Frieza's most powerful and most unusual soldiers, each carrying a power level that dwarfed everything the Earth's fighters could manage. Each with an individual fighting style that reflected something specific about their personalities. Their captain, Ginyu, possessed an ability that no training could prepare a person for: the capacity to switch bodies with a target, abandoning whatever physical form he currently occupied and inhabiting another. This was the kind of power that operated outside the standard framework of combat capability, and it created a crisis that was resolved through a combination of Gohan's quick thinking and a frog. The arrival of Goku changed the mathematics of the conflict on Namek in a single unambiguous way. He had trained on the journey, in a ship equipped with gravity amplifiers, under conditions that pressed him significantly harder than the North Kai's planet had. His power when he landed was high enough that the scouters in the area registered and then failed to register it properly, the readings climbing past the point where the devices could make useful sense of the numbers. He defeated the Ginyu Force members with the same unhurried competence with which he moved through most obstacles. He saved Gohan and Krillin and continued toward the crisis that was already deepening ahead of him. Frieza, who had been steadily escalating through the violence he brought to the Namekian villages in his search for the Dragon Balls, had gathered all 7 spheres and summoned Porunga, the Namekian dragon, enormous and ancient and bound by rules that were different from Shenron's. Porunga granted wishes, But before Frieza could speak the wish that would give him immortality, the Dragon Balls were claimed by Vegeta and Krillin and Gohan acting together, and the wishes were used for other purposes. Piccolo was wished to Namek. Others were wished back to life. Frieza's wish went unspoken. What followed was a battle of escalating revelation, Frieza revealing, across several increasingly desperate exchanges, that his visible form was not his true form, that he had suppressed his own power across multiple transformation stages specifically because its full expression was too difficult to manage in casual operation. The first revealed form was larger and more angular and considerably more powerful. The second was sleeker, more compact, more controlled. The third was something from a nightmare, an exaggerated biological horror that seemed designed to be fundamentally unsettling. And the fourth form, the one that followed, smaller than the third, elegant and pale, and entirely self-contained, was so much more powerful than everything that had preceded it, that it rearranged every measurement anyone present had been using. Vegeta, who had pursued his own agenda throughout the Namek conflict, fought Frieza with everything he had and was killed, easily, quickly, finally. He died on the grass of Namek with tears on his face, speaking to Goku with the particular urgency of a person who understood that certain things could only be said once. He asked Goku to be what the Saiyan race could not produce for itself, to be the one who stood against the person who had destroyed their world. The tears were not grief in any simple sense. They were the product of a pride that had finally, under the specific pressure of the end, found something it was willing to set aside. Goku fought Frieza. He fought him across a landscape that was already crumbling and flooding from the damage the planet had sustained, with a precision and a power that was higher than anything he had brought to any previous encounter. But still, for much of the battle, not enough. Frieza was in another category. The techniques that had ended every previous fight were absorbed and deflected and used as information rather than problems. The Spirit Bomb was gathered, enormous, drawing from every corner of the solar system, and released. It was not enough. Krillin died. He was killed by Frieza, lifted from the ground and exploded, the act casual, performed as a demonstration of what contempt looked like when it had enough power behind it. The sound that left Goku in response to that was not a battle cry in any conventional sense. It was something underneath battle cries, something earlier than technique or intention, something that had been building since the fight began, and perhaps since long before that. The change began in the color of his hair, gold spreading from the roots outward. His eyes shifted. His power level ceased to be something a scouter could measure in any useful way. The Super Saiyan transformation had arrived, the legend that had persisted across Saiyan oral tradition for generations, the form that Yamoshi had briefly touched an age ago, and that the species had carried as myth ever since, was now present on a flooding planet in the outer reaches of the galaxy, embodied in a young man from Earth who had, until very recently, never known he was a Saiyan at all. Frieza, who had destroyed planet Vegeta in part because of his fear of that legend, faced what he had been afraid of. The battle that followed was not close. Namek's destruction came during the course of the fight. The planet's core had been damaged beyond repair, and the world they were standing on had minutes remaining before it ceased to be a world at all. Piccolo and Gohan and the others escaped on Frieza's ship. Goku stayed to finish the fight, eventually allowing Frieza to survive with enough energy to crawl away, and then searching for a ship of his own as the planet came apart beneath him. He was not found among the survivors who returned to Earth. The reports reached the planet slowly, and with the particular uncertainty that comes from a battle scene where multiple people had been working to undo the conditions of the battle at the same time they were fighting it. The Dragon Balls of Namek, after the planet's destruction, had been relocated to a new world created by the Namekian elder who had granted their power, eventually arriving at a location that the surviving Namekians could call home. The Earth's Dragon Balls were restored with Piccolo's revival. Those who had died on Namek were wished back. The people of Earth absorbed the news of what had happened in a galaxy they had never thought to watch, and the Z-Fighters waited for Goku to come home. He had survived the planet's destruction by finding a working ship in the chaos of the final minutes, and spent the travel time in that ship's training room, continuing to work at the abilities the Super Saiyan transformation had unlocked, pushing his understanding of what that power actually was and what it cost to maintain. When he finally landed on Earth, the reunion was quiet by the standards of what everyone had been through. Genuine warmth, no particular ceremony, the specific comfort of a table with people around it who had each changed and each remained themselves. But the peace that followed Namek was built on something less stable than it appeared. In the cosmos, Frieza had survived, recovered from near destruction by his father, King Cold, reconstructed using technology that had rebuilt the parts of him that Goku had shattered, emerging from that reconstruction with a mechanical component to his appearance that carried its own specific kind of menace. He turned toward Earth with an army broadcasting his intention as clearly as possible. Not a military operation, but a message delivered personally about what happened to planets whose warriors had the presumption to damage him. He arrived, and then something else arrived first. A young man with lavender hair descended from the sky, calmly and without explanation, and killed Frieza and his entire army in a matter of minutes. The ease with which he did so was the kind of thing that did not process immediately. Each individual action made sense, and the accumulation of them into a comprehensive military erasure required a moment of silence before it could be properly understood. He had achieved the Super Saiyan transformation as well. He was skilled, he was fast, he was not afraid of anything he encountered, including Frieza, including King Cold, including the complete absence of anyone around him who could help if something went wrong. He waited for Goku, who arrived as the young man had apparently predicted, a few minutes later in a different ship, coming from a different direction. They spoke privately. The young man's name, shared only with Goku, was Trunks. He was the son of Bulma and Vegeta, from a future that was significantly worse than the present they were currently standing in. He had traveled back through time to warn them, and what was coming was not an alien or a conqueror from space, but something built right here, on Earth, by a scientist whose work had outlasted his own awareness of what it had become. Androids. In 3 years' time, 2 artificial humans, numbered 17 and 18, would activate and begin killing. In the future that Trunks came from, they had killed most of the Z fighters without apparent difficulty and spent years doing what they liked to the world below, while the survivors adapted as best they could to a situation that offered no particular exit. Trunks had survived, trained under the remaining Gohan of his time, watched him die, and come back through time with a warning and a medicine, a cure for a heart virus that would kill Goku during the android conflict if it was not treated. He left. The Z fighters trained for 3 years, knowing exactly enough about what was coming to be afraid, and knowing that fear was not something they had ever found particularly useful. The 3 years passed. The androids appeared, not at the location Trunks had specified because the timeline had already shifted in response to his intervention, placing the androids at a different location on a slightly different schedule. The versions that appeared were different in number and configuration from what Trunks had described, because the scientist responsible for their creation had continued working in the intervening years, and his plans had evolved beyond the version that Trunks had been aware of. Dr. Gero was the name. He had been the chief scientist of the Red Ribbon Army, the mind behind the technology that Goku had so comprehensively destroyed years before. And he had spent the intervening decades in an underground laboratory working on a project whose scope had grown continuously beyond its original parameters. The androids he had built, 17, 18, 19, and 20, the last being Dr. Gero himself in a mechanical body, were the visible portion of a project whose most ambitious element was still in development, something called Cell, an artificial being created from the genetic material of every major fighter on Earth, designed to be the perfect synthesis of all of them, built to absorb both Android 17 and 18 and achieve a final form whose power would exceed anything Gero had originally planned. The battle with the androids revealed something fundamental about the 3 years of training the Z fighters had done. They had grown, substantially. Vegeta had achieved Super Saiyan. Trunks had arrived again. this time staying to help rather than just to warn. The power levels in play had shifted significantly from the baseline that the Saiyan battle had established. And still, the androids, particularly the original 17 and 18, were operating casually at levels that the Z fighters struggled to match. The discovery of Cell's empty larval shell, grown to full size and now loose in the world, introduced a different kind of urgency. Cell was absorbing people, draining them through his tail, adding their biological energy to his own, growing stronger with each absorption in a way that was both more efficient and more horrifying than any previous power accumulation method anyone had encountered. The timeline complicated further. A Cell from a slightly different future version had traveled back to this one, and his presence created a situation in which multiple versions of the same crisis were overlapping in ways that required careful attention to follow. The hyperbolic time chamber was a room within Kami's floating structure that experienced time differently from the outside world. One day in the external world corresponded to 1 year inside the chamber. Compressed into a space with extreme gravity and temperatures at its edges that tested survival in ways that went beyond combat. Goku and Gohan entered together. Vegeta and Trunks had been the first through, Vegeta emerging as something beyond normal Super Saiyan, a form he called Super Saiyan second grade, carrying greater muscle mass and significantly greater power at the cost of speed. Trunks had found something similar independently. Goku and Gohan emerged differently. Goku had found a way to exist in Super Saiyan continuously, to carry the transformation as a natural state rather than a triggered response, so that the power was always present and the stamina cost of maintaining it gradually became negligible through sustained exposure. He had also found something else, something he held in reserve, and Gohan, quiet, scholarly, somewhat reluctant Gohan, had grown into the chamber's full year with a focus that surprised his father and an increase in power that exceeded anything Goku had expected. The child who had spent his whole life carrying potential he had never fully chosen to access was beginning, in that compressed year, to choose. Cell, having absorbed both Android 17 and 18 across a period of terrible efficiency, achieved his perfect form, a body that was, by his own account, the culmination of everything his creator had designed it to be. He was elegant in a way that nothing of his origin suggested he should be, and he had a particular fondness for spectacle that expressed itself in the announcement of a tournament. He called it the Cell Games. He would fight challengers, one at a time, in a ring he had constructed himself, and he would do so in the tradition of the martial arts tournaments that the world had historically used to celebrate its strongest fighters. Anyone who defeated him could have the Earth back. He waited, broadcasting the invitation, apparently quite relaxed about the whole thing. Goku entered the Cell Games and fought Cell in a match that demonstrated what a year in the hyperbolic time chamber looked like in practice. The two of them exchanged technique for technique across a sustained encounter in which the audience, watching from a safe distance, gradually understood that what they were seeing was not a fight for survival, but something closer to an evaluation. Goku was feeling out what Cell was, and Cell was feeling out what Goku was, and neither of them was surprised by what they found. The match ended with Goku conceding, stepping out of the ring, saying that someone else would fight in his place. Gohan? Cell was not concerned about Gohan. He was aware of the child's power, had been aware of it since the first encounter, since the data he carried from Goku's genetic material included an awareness of what the boy was capable of. But awareness of potential and the practical reality of having to face it were different things, and Cell's estimation of the gap between them led him to believe the tournament portion of his plan would be brief. The fight began. Gohan was good. He was very good, precise and fast, and carrying within him the full product of everything Goku had seen in the hyperbolic time chamber. But he did not go further. He had the ability available to him to go further. He knew it was there. The feeling of it was like a door he could reach, but had not yet decided to open, because opening it required something he had spent his whole life being somewhat reluctant to access: the anger, the specific and consuming fury that had expressed itself twice before in his life at moments of crisis, burning past all his careful, studious, measured habits until the thing underneath them was all that remained. Cell, understanding this, decided to help. He created 7 small versions of himself, Cell Juniors, and sent them toward the people Gohan cared about. They were strong enough to hurt fighters who had survived the Saiyan battle and the Namek conflict. They began doing so. And Android 16, one of the androids who had been rebuilt, who had fought Cell and been defeated and lay dormant until this moment, was brought close enough to the fight to speak one final time. He told Gohan what he saw clearly and what Gohan could not quite see yet, that protecting the things you love required the willingness to be fully, unreservedly what you were. The head was crushed, and the door opened. The Super Saiyan second transformation, what would later be called Super Saiyan 2, expressed itself in Gohan with a quality that was different from every previous power increase anyone present had witnessed. There was no gradual escalation. There was simply an interval of electrical discharge, and then Gohan was standing there completely calm, with the Cell Juniors no longer being a concern. He dismantled all 7 of them in a window of time too brief to process comfortably. Cell, receiving this data in real time, adjusted his estimate of the situation substantially. The fight between Gohan and Cell was unlike the fight between Goku and Cell in every qualitative way. Cell was desperate where he had been relaxed. Gohan was calm where Goku had been deliberate. The power difference was visible in the physical quality of each exchange. Cell's regeneration barely keeping pace with damage that arrived faster than his biology had been designed to handle. He self-destructed. Gohan felt the explosion coming, but before it could take him, Goku, from whatever space dead fighters occupied between the living world and the afterlife, used his instant transmission to teleport Cell somewhere else. He died, taking the blast. Cell survived. Regeneration from a single cell was still within his parameters. He returned even stronger, carrying a Saiyan trait he had inherited from the genetic material in his construction, the ability to grow more powerful from near-death experiences. He killed Trunks. He prepared a final Kamehameha of planetary scale. Gohan, with one arm damaged, refused to step back. Vegeta, the pride of Saiyan princes, attacked from the side, not for tactical purpose, but because there was something in watching his son die and watching Gohan stand alone that had more authority over his actions than any strategy could. Gohan released everything that remained. Cell did not regenerate from that. If you're still awake halfway through, maybe subscribe before you drift off and tell me what time it is where you're watching from. Goku chose to remain in the afterlife rather than return to the living world immediately, a decision that caused Chi-Chi, the specific brand of grief that comes from someone you love, making a decision that reveals something about their priorities that you had perhaps hoped was less true. His reasoning, shared with his closest friends at the moment of conclusion, was that his presence had drawn danger to the Earth on multiple occasions, and that a period of death-adjacent absence might allow the planet to breathe without the particular magnetic pull that seemed to draw catastrophe toward wherever Goku happened to be standing. He trained in the afterlife. He trained under a being called the Grand Kai, and then under the North Kai, and then he participated in the Other World Tournament, encountering fighters from other universes who had been collecting power over centuries of post-mortem competition. The years passed differently in that space. He found in the accumulation of them a quality of focus that the living world's urgencies had never quite allowed. On Earth, the 7 years between the Cell games and the next major crisis were genuinely peaceful in a way that Dragon Ball's story had not permitted before. Gohan went to school, entered the ordinary social world of study and homework, and the specific comedy of being a supremely powerful being trying to pass as a normal student, which he managed with moderate success until a villain called the Great Saiyuman Persona was born from a combination of costume and the particular brand of embarrassment that only teenagers can generate at volume. Vidile, daughter of Hercule, the man who had taken public credit for Cell's defeat, and built a considerable career on that credit. Entered Gohan's orbit with the same directness her father had always brought to confrontation, which is to say she walked toward the mystery of him without hesitation and demanded answers. What followed was the particular comedy and grace of two people discovering each other honestly, which Gohan navigated with all the same talent he brought to everything that was not combat. Goku returned for one day. The World Martial Arts Tournament had been organized, the 25th in the official count, and he was allowed a single day of living presence to attend and compete. He met his second son for the first time, Goten, born after Goku had left and already capable of Super Saiyan transformation at an age that made Vegeta briefly and privately furious, was a smaller and more straightforwardly cheerful version of his father in ways that seemed to exist for the sole purpose of producing that specific reaction. Trunks, who had grown up with Vegeta as an active and present father in ways that the future version of himself had not experienced, had become something quite different from the reserved, deliberate young man who had arrived twice from the future with warnings. Present timeline Trunks had Vegeta's pride and his mother's intelligence and something all his own, a particular confidence that expressed itself mostly as an inability to find anyone around him sufficiently interesting. The tournament produced, among other developments, a disruption. The wizard Babidi, the son of BBD, who had created Majin Buu, had come to Earth with a specific purpose. He was feeding on the negative energy produced during fights, using it to power his reanimation process for the dormant Buu that had been sleeping in his shell since BBD's death long ago. He had corrupted Vegeta, not by force but by offering Vegeta something Vegeta had wanted and would not admit to wanting, the pure, uncomplicated freedom to be exactly what he was, without restraint, without the quiet accommodation of living beside people he had, over 7 years, stopped being able to categorize as the enemy. Majin Buu was released from his shell. The creature that emerged was not the version that anyone who had been briefed on his history had expected, not the destroyer of supreme Kais, not the terror of universes, but something stout and pink and almost childlike, bouncing through the world with the carefree energy of a being for whom harm and play existed in the same emotional space. He was still enormously powerful. He was still capable of destruction on a scale that had no reasonable local response. But he was not, in his presented form, the apocalyptic entity that the Supreme Kai had been warning about. Gohan was sent to the sacred world of the Kai to draw the Z-sword, the weapon embedded in stone that no Kai had been able to remove. He drew it with ease, which said something about the gap between Gohan's current capability and the capability of divine beings who had struggled with the same task. While training with the sword, they discovered something unexpected, that the blade was extraordinarily brittle despite its legendary status, shattering when tested with a sufficiently dense material. And from within the shattered blade, an old man tumbled out, small, round, wearing thick glasses, considerably more confused than the situation he found himself in seemed to warrant. This was the old Kai, the elder Supreme Kai who had been sealed inside the blade by Beerus, so long ago that the circumstances of his imprisonment had become a matter of historical record rather than living memory. He was irritable. He was eccentric. He had, somewhere within the indignation he carried about his decades of confinement, an ability that no training could replicate. The capacity to fully unlock someone's potential, to remove whatever natural limits existed on their power, to reveal what they actually were beneath the layers of what they had managed to develop. He agreed to perform this ceremony for Gohan, with conditions, over a procedure that took approximately 24 hours of ritual sitting. Buu's history of absorptions continued to complicate the situation. He absorbed good Buu, the portion of himself that had developed softness from absorbing the gentle Grand Supreme Kai long ago, and became Super Buu, a version with greater intelligence, greater volatility, and significantly greater power than the round, childlike form that had bounced out of the shell. He absorbed Gotenks, the fusion of Goten and Trunks, who had developed the fusion technique with Piccolo's guidance and who were, in their fused state, genuinely extraordinary fighters. He absorbed Piccolo, He absorbed Gohan, who had arrived at the sacred world of the Kai with his potential fully unlocked and his power at a level that would, in normal circumstances, have been overwhelming. Each absorption made him not just more powerful, but more complex, more of each absorbed person's capabilities folding into his already remarkable biology. The situation seemed to be closing its options one by one. Then Goku, who had been training in the afterlife using the last of a technique borrowed from the divine, arrived as a limited-time presence in the living world and introduced an option that had not previously been considered. The Potara earrings, divine accessories belonging to the Supreme Kais, capable of permanently fusing the two people who wore one each, a fusion more complete and more powerful than the dance technique, whose duration was unlimited, and whose result was not merely the combination of two fighters' abilities, but something genuinely different from either of them alone. Goku fused with Vegeta. They became Vegito. And Vegito, facing Buu in his most absorbed and most powerful configuration, was something that had not existed before, and carried within it a power that the situation finally had an answer to. Vegito was pulled inside Buu's body, deliberately, as a rescue operation to extract Gohan and Piccolo and Goten and Trunks from their absorbed state. The Potara fusion undid itself inside Buu, something the Kai had not anticipated, and Goku and Vegeta were themselves again. They extracted their people. Buu reverted, through the removals, to something closer to his original Kid Buu form. The purest version, without the modifying influence, of any absorbed being. Kid Buu was simpler than Super Buu and, in certain ways, more terrible for being simple. There was nothing in him that could be reasoned with, appealed to, or delayed by the weight of his own intelligence. He destroyed the Earth. Mr. Popo wished the planet back. Goku and Vegeta fought Kid Buu on the sacred world of the Kai, with the full weight of everything they had. Both of them at full power, Vegeta holding Buu occupied while Goku gathered a spirit bomb of sufficient scale. Goku asked the Earth's population for energy, the people who did not understand what was happening and who had been asked by Hercule, of all people, to raise their hands and give something, contributed. The spirit bomb grew to the necessary size. Goku launched it. Kid Buu pushed back with everything he had, and it required Vegeta's wish, using the last Namekian Dragon Ball wish to restore Goku's full strength, to tip the balance. The spirit bomb consumed Kid Buu entirely. Nothing regenerated. Nothing was left. Good Buu, who had been separated from Kid Buu before the final confrontation, survived. He was wished back to life and settled into a domestic existence with Hercule, which suited both of them in ways that neither would necessarily have predicted. The Saiyan, who had once been the most feared creature in the universe, became in time a figure of quiet neighborhood legend, known for his cooking and his naps. In a time after the Buu conflict, but before the specific events that would mark the beginning of a new era, a being of divine authority stirred from a long and comfortable sleep. Beerus, the god of destruction of Universe 7, had been dreaming, and the dream had brought him a specific image, clear and golden and carrying the unmistakable energy signature of something he had been half hoping to encounter for a very long time. The dream showed him a Super Saiyan god. He woke with a sense of purpose he had not felt in quite some years. Whis, his attendant, organized the journey. Beerus visited the various divine locations where such information might be gathered, and eventually arrived on Earth, where a birthday party for Bulma had gathered a somewhat remarkable concentration of the people most connected to what he was looking for. The encounter between Beerus and the gathered Z fighters was, for most of those fighters, an education in the specific experience of facing a power so completely beyond their framework that the normal vocabulary of combat assessment simply did not apply. The resolution required the Super Saiyan God ritual, 5 Saiyans contributing their energy to a 6th, as the old legend described. The transformation that resulted when Goku received that power was different from the gold of Super Saiyan. It was red, a quiet, still red, carrying a quality of divine ki that made everything feel slightly more significant. Goku fought Beerus as a Super Saiyan god, The fight was the first in his experience that made him feel small again in the specific way of early challenges, and simultaneously gave him a sense of the ceiling's actual location, which was considerably higher than he had understood. Beerus chose not to destroy the earth. He had enjoyed the party, he had tasted pudding. He went home, declared that he had not yet found what he was looking for, in the precise sense he was looking for it, and that the search was ongoing. Frieza's resurrection came through the Dragon Balls, arranged by his remaining lieutenants. He spent 4 months training, 4 months in which he achieved, for the first time in his life, the full realization of the potential his biology had always contained, but he had never needed to develop through effort. He had been naturally powerful enough that training had seemed unnecessary. What 4 months of deliberate practice produced was something he called Golden Frieza, a transformation that matched or exceeded Goku's new god-level power and raw output at the cost of a stamina depletion rate that his newly trained body had not yet conditioned against. He arrived on Earth with an army and a very specific set of intentions. The battle was brief in geological time and considerable by the standards of everyone involved. Goku and Vegeta each fought Frieza in their new forms, Goku using the Super Saiyan Blue transformation, which combined the Super Saiyan form with the divine ki of the God form to produce a power that was quieter and more controlled than either alone. Vegeta had his own version of the same transformation, developed through his own training under Whis. Frieza, his stamina failing, shifted his resolution to a final option, destroying the Earth itself, which he had always been willing to do, and had simply been deferring in favor of the more satisfying outcome of direct victory. Whis reversed time. Goku, informed by the reset, reached Frieza and killed him before the planet was destroyed, with a simplicity that made the resolution seem slightly anticlimactic by comparison to everything that had preceded it. A tournament was organized between Universe 7 and Universe 6, 2 universes that existed in a kind of paired relationship, mirror images in certain cosmic definitions, whose representatives Beerus and Champa had been arguing about for reasons that were, at the divine level, primarily about food and personal pride. The prize for winning the tournament was the Super Dragon Balls, 7 enormous spheres, each roughly the size of a planet, that had been created at the dawn of the universe's current age, and that could grant any wish without limitation. The winning universe would receive all 7. The losing universe would receive the satisfaction of having competed. The tournament introduced fighters from Universe 6, whose existence expanded the Dragon Ball world in interesting directions. The Saiyans of Universe 6, Caulifla and Kale, were different in their experience from Universe 7's Saiyans, carrying the same biology but a different history, and they achieved their own transformation milestones across the course of the tournament in ways that had resonance for everyone watching. There was Hit, a legendary assassin of Universe 6, whose time-skip technique created genuine difficulty for Goku even at full power, because the technique worked differently from physical speed and required a different cognitive approach to counter. There was Frost, a figure who appeared initially to be the Universe 6 equivalent of a heroic version of Frieza, and revealed himself over the course of the tournament to be precisely what you would expect from a Universe 6 version of Frieza. The tournament concluded with Universe 7's victory. The Super Dragon Balls were used, by Beerus' decision, to restore Universe 6's Earth, which had been destroyed at some point in its history and not yet rebuilt. It was, in the full context of everything Beerus had done over the course of the story, an unusually generous gesture, made without comment and without apparent expectation of acknowledgement. A future from a different timeline than Trunks' own, the third timeline in the expanded Dragon Ball Super accounting of parallel histories, had gone in a different direction from the one he knew. In that timeline, a Supreme Kai apprentice named Zamasu had become something that Supreme Kais were not supposed to become. He had looked at mortals with the particular contempt of someone who believed that power conveyed not just authority, but justification for using it absolutely. And his dissatisfaction with the divine arrangement that asked gods to guide rather than govern had found expression in a plan of extraordinary scope. He had used a time ring, a device belonging to the Supreme Kais that allowed limited access to future timelines, to travel to a point where the Super Dragon Balls had been gathered, and he had used them to switch bodies with Goku. Goku's body, with Zamasu's divine soul inside it, became the figure known as Goku's physical capabilities, and none of Goku's values, who used that body as a weapon against the world, with a methodical efficiency that was as much philosophical statement as military action. Future Trunks, having survived that timeline's devastation with a level of loss that went beyond anything his experience had prepared him for, built a second time machine with the fuel his mother had preserved, and traveled back once more. The crisis he brought with him was different from the android warning, more personal, more specific, touching on questions about what divine authority meant when the divine had decided it meant license to destroy. The confrontation across timelines with Goku, Black, and Zamasu, who merged eventually using Potara fusion into a being combining mortal power and divine immortality, produced some of the most extended and emotionally weighted fights in Dragon Ball Super's story. The merged form was theoretically impossible to defeat by the standard logic of the conflict, because one component was physically powerful beyond measurement and the other could not be killed. The resolution came from outside the standard combat framework. Trunks, drawing on something that was not quite key in the traditional sense, but a genuine expression of collective will, gathering the remaining spirit of his devastated future world into a blade of focused energy and ending merged Zamasu's physical form. It did not end entirely. The divine component that could not be killed expanded rather than being contained, threatening to consume the timeline entirely. The resolution was absolute. The Zeno of that future timeline, who Goku had given a small button to call for just such an emergency, arrived and erased everything. The timeline was gone. Trunks and Mai, who had survived, were guided by Whis to yet another branching timeline, one where Beerus had preemptively destroyed Zamasu before his plans had come to fruition, where the crisis had never begun. It was, as resolutions went, an enormous cost for a version of safety that had a particular quality of starting over. The Tournament of Power was announced. Zeno, both versions of him, the original and the future Zeno who had been brought forward through time by Goku, had been looking for entertainment, and the universe-scale tournament format that Goku had inadvertently suggested during a casual conversation had lodged in the Omni King's attention and refused to leave. 8 universes would compete. The 4 universes with the highest mortal level rankings had been exempted. The remaining 8 would each assemble a team of 10 fighters. The winning universe would survive. Every other universe competing would be erased. This was presented as a tournament in the traditional sense, with the traditional structure of competition, and the violence of what would happen to the losers was delivered with the same casualness that characterized Zeno's relationship to every outcome. The gods of destruction of the competing universes spent the preparation period in various states of barely contained panic, which they expressed as urgency in constructing the strongest teams possible. Universe 7's assembly was Goku's project largely, with the administrative complications that accompanied any project that Goku was personally responsible for coordinating. He sought out the strongest fighters available, returning to Frieza, who was wished back to life for the duration of the tournament with the specific incentive of remaining alive afterward as his reward for participating. He recruited Android 17, who had been spending the years since Cell in a nature preserve alone with his own considerable capabilities, growing steadily through quiet daily training while tending to the wildlife in his care. The arena for the Tournament of Power existed in a void beyond the normal structure of the universes, a stage constructed specifically for the event, surrounded by spectator platforms where the gods and angels watched with a particular detachment of beings for whom the scale of the stakes was simultaneously enormous and abstract. 80 fighters stood on the stage when the battle began. The rule was simple: fall off the stage and you were out. The last universe standing would be preserved. The early rounds produced a chaos that was difficult to track in full. 80 fighters, many with abilities that had not been observed outside their own universes, sorting into alliances and confrontations with the speed of something that had been building pressure for the full extent of the preparation period. Universe 9 was the first to fall entirely, erased so early in the proceedings that the gesture seemed almost administrative. Universe 10 followed. The numbers on the stage contracted. The fighters from Universe 7 who established themselves as individually significant were numerous. Android 17's control, his tactical awareness, his apparently unlimited stamina, the product of an energy system that did not deplete through exertion the way organic ki did, made him a persistent and effective presence across the full span of the tournament. Frieza operated in ways that were difficult to categorize as team effort, and more accurately described as Frieza doing exactly what served Frieza's interests, which happened to occasionally align with what served Universe 7's interests at the same angles. Gohan recovered from the years of academic focus and recommitted to the martial life in a way that had a specific quality of wholeness about it, fought as a team leader with a combination of power and coordination that his earlier career had rarely allowed him to express. The fighter who came to define the tournament from Universe 11 was named Jiren. He was, by any measurement anyone on the stage possessed, something categorically apart from everyone else. His power operating in a register that made Super Saiyan Blue seem like an earlier stage of the same problem rather than a solution to it. He was a member of Pride Troopers, elite warriors of Universe 11, and he carried his strength with the specific quality of someone who had found in it not pride, but a kind of grief, a history of loss that had produced in him a conviction that only absolute power could protect anything worth protecting, and that sentiment was the first vulnerability that any enemy would exploit. Goku fought him and was destroyed in the exchange, not physically, but the gap was made clear. The spirit bomb technique, which had ended Kid Buu and carried the energy of civilizations willing to give what they had, was deflected back at Goku by Jiren with what appeared to be effortlessness. What happened in the immediate aftermath of that deflection was something that had been approaching from the distance of the entire Dragon Ball Super story. Ultra Instinct, the technique that even gods struggled to master, the state of being that Whis had been alluding to across years of training description, in which the body acted independently of conscious thought, each movement perfectly optimized without the delay of intention, activated in Goku for the first time as a response to impossible pressure. He moved through Jiren's attacks with a quality that had not been present in any previous technique. His body was not faster, it was simply always somewhere else by the time an attack arrived. The state did not hold. It came and went through the tournament's remaining rounds and intervals that grew longer with each activation, as if Goku's understanding of how to access it was deepening through each brief experience of it. Meanwhile, the stage contracted. Universe after universe fell. Universe 6 was erased when its last fighters were eliminated. The numbers across all 8 universes fell toward a final accounting. Jiren, having faced Goku in a state closer to his actual maximum, had shown things about himself that were unusual. He had been pushed, not defeated, but genuinely pushed, and the experience had brought something forward in him that had not been visible in his standard posture. Anger. The kind of anger that comes not from pride but from fear, from the specific terror of someone who has built an identity entirely around an absolute principle and has just discovered that the principle may not be as absolute as they required it to be. In his anger, he lost some of what made him what he was, and what replaced it was less precise, less controlled, and in certain ways more dangerous. Goku activated the completed Ultra Instinct form, the silver-haired state that the angels operated within as their default condition, and fought Jiren in full. The fight was extraordinary. The form burned through Goku's physical limits faster than his body could sustain, but for its duration it was something the universe had not seen before. He was forced out of the state. Android 17 and Frieza helped, Universe 7 operating briefly as a team, in a formation that no one who knew any of them individually would have predicted. Jiren was eliminated. Universe 11 was erased. Only Android 17 remained standing at the final count. He had weathered the entirety of the tournament through a combination of skill, endurance, and the particular tactical wisdom of someone who understood that the goal was to remain standing, not to be the last one who had made an impressive statement. He was asked for his wish. He wished for all the erased universes to be restored. The Omni King's attendants processed this with the expression of beings who had perhaps been uncertain whether anyone would make that choice. All the erased universes came back. The tournament concluded. Dragon Ball Super, Broly returned to the origins, to planet Vegeta in its final days, to the infant children and the decisions made about them, to a history that had been told in pieces across decades and was now being assembled in full with the visual and emotional quality that only a dedicated film could provide. The Broly introduced in this film was the canon Broly, the one whose story replaced the non-canon version from older films and whose character had been developed with Akira Toriyama's direct involvement from the beginning. Broly's childhood on Vampa, the barren planet where he had been exiled, was decades of survival in a hostile environment, accompanied only by his father Paragus and the creature that had become his companion through circumstance rather than choice, a small-eared being that Broly called Ba, found in the planet's underground. His power had continued to grow through those decades in isolation, untrained and undirected, fed by the simple biological process of a Saiyan whose growth potential had no apparent ceiling. Paragus had spent those decades nursing a grievance against the royal line that had exiled his son, against Frieza, who had destroyed their race, against the entire architecture of the universe that had arranged for Broly to be sent away and for Paragus to spend his life on a dead planet, protecting a son who did not know why his own strength frightened everyone around him. He had the collar, the device that allowed him to manage Broly's power when it exceeded a manageable threshold, and he had a plan, which was essentially to point Broly at Vegeta and let the accumulated force of all that suppressed anger do the work that Paragus could never do himself. The meeting between Broly and the Universe 7 fighters took place in the Arctic, and what followed was an escalation that moved through stages with the steady pressure of something geological rather than tactical. Vegeta fought first, methodically assessing. He was winning, and then he was not. Broly's growth rate during combat, the Saiyan ability to grow stronger from a near-death experience, amplified in Broly to a degree that was essentially continuous rather than episodic, accelerated past any measurement that the standard framework provided. Goku took over. Super Saiyan Blue was engaged. The gap narrowed. The gap closed. The gap inverted, and Goku was on the defensive in a fight where the defensive was not a stable long-term position. The landscape of the Arctic, which had been a flat and featureless expanse of ice when the fight began, ceased to resemble anything that had been there before. The resolution required fusion. Goku and Vegeta performed the fusion dance, requiring, in circumstances where the participants were barely holding their forms together, a precision that the dance's requirements imposed without mercy, and became Gogeta. The fused form's power relative to Broly was different from the trajectory that the individual fights had established, and the fight became something different in character, less a survival exercise and more a genuine contest, with the outcome in doubt and the moments within it carrying the specific weight of genuine uncertainty. The Dragon Balls resolved it. Shilai, a young woman who had befriended Broly during the Frieza Force's discovery of him, who understood something about what it meant to be trapped in service to someone else's agenda, used the gathered balls to wish Broly away to Vampa, removing him from the field before Gogeta's next attack could end it permanently. Broly went home. Goku, having separated from the fusion, visited Vampa personally to bring supplies and to make an implicit offer that the training and the company of equals, which Broly had never had access to, might eventually be available if he wanted it. The Galactic Patrol prisoner arc brought the conflict with Morrow, the planet-consuming wizard who had threatened Universe 7 10 million years before the current age, who had been sealed away by the Grand Supreme Kai at enormous personal cost, and who had now escaped his imprisonment when the seal weakened and his own power had recovered sufficient strength to break it. He was not a fighter in the conventional sense, though he was capable of formidable combat. He was something more specific, a being who consumed the life energy of planets and people, absorbing it into himself, growing stronger through the taking of what others had grown and nurtured. Goku and Vegeta, recruited into the Galactic Patrol in recognition of their involvement in the crisis, tracked Morrow across several planets while he fed on their populations and grew. The encounters were difficult in ways that were specific to Morrow's abilities. He could drain ki, could steal techniques by absorbing the magic of enemies he had consumed, and the combination of stolen power and ancient magical ability made him something that neither Goku nor Vegeta could end through sheer force accumulation. Vegeta traveled to Yardrat, the planet where Goku had recovered after Namek and where he had learned instant transmission, and spent his time there training in a different tradition entirely. The Yardration's technique, spirit fission, worked in reverse of Morrow's absorption. It could forcibly separate fused or absorbed beings, extracting whatever had been merged back into its component parts. It was not a combat power increase in any conventional sense. It was a precision tool built for exactly the crisis they were in. Goku trained with Beerus, a galactic patrolman of unusual capability who turned out to be an angel operating incognito in the mortal world, a situation that created its own complications when the angelic hierarchy's rules about involvement came into direct tension with Beerus's personal investment in the outcome. Goku's training focused on accessing Ultra Instinct reliably, not as a crisis response, but as a technique, something that could be entered deliberately and maintained. The Granolah arc expanded the Dragon Ball world's history in a direction that touched directly on the Saiyan past. Granolah was the last surviving member of a species called the Saiyans, wiped out during Frieza's reign of conquest by the Saiyan army, the same assault that had spared only Granolah himself, saved by a Saiyan named Bardock, who had defied his orders for reasons the current story was only beginning to understand. Granolah had spent decades as a bounty hunter, carrying his grief and his hatred with precision. And when the Cerealian Dragon Balls became available to him, he made a wish that had a specific logical inevitability. He wished to become the strongest fighter in the universe. The wish was granted at a cost. Granolah's natural lifespan was compressed significantly in exchange for the power the wish delivered. He was, upon awakening from the wish, the most powerful mortal fighter currently alive. He had never met Goku or Vegeta. He had never trained against anyone at a comparable level. He had the power without the context for it, and while power without context was still enormously capable, it was missing something that the Z fighters carried in the accumulated scar tissue of their training history. Vegeta's encounter with Granolah produced the Ultra Ego transformation, a divine form that operated on the God of Destruction's principle rather than the Angel's principle, growing stronger as it sustained damage rather than refining toward technical perfection. It was a form suited to Vegeta's philosophy, in a way that Ultra Instinct was not, and its emergence in the middle of the Granolah fight was both tactically significant and something that felt, in the larger arc of Vegeta's character development, like an appropriate answer. Dragon Ball Superhero took place on Earth and centered on Gohan and Piccolo, stepping away from Goku and Vegeta for the first time in a significant story to give the Earth's defenders a crisis that belonged specifically to them. The Red Ribbon Army, reconstructed under a pharmaceutical front organization, had commissioned from Dr. Hito, the grandson of the original Dr. Gero, a project that updated the android program for the current era. The result was Cell Max, a forced activation of a project that had not been completed to its intended parameters, releasing something enormous and angry, and without the capacity for the restraint or the theater that the original Cell had brought to his operation. Piccolo's preparation for the crisis was methodical and, in its way, characteristic. He used the Dragon Balls to request a power unlock, specifically asking Shenron for a new transformation that would allow him to operate at the level the incoming threat required. The orange Piccolo form that resulted was visibly different from previous Piccolo transformations, and carried an enormous power increase that placed him in a range he had not occupied since the early days when he had been the most powerful being on Earth. He also staged Pan's kidnapping, his own granddaughter figure essentially, the daughter of Gohan, as a deliberate provocation. Having assessed that Gohan's full power required a specific emotional trigger and that no training exercise would produce that trigger as reliably as a genuine perceived threat to someone he loved, it was manipulative in the precise sense that it was manipulative. Piccolo knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway, because the alternative was Gohan being undersupplied for what was coming. Gohan Beast was the form that emerged during the fight, a white-haired transformation that represented the full expression of Gohan's unique power type, the potential that had always been there from early childhood. Unlocked in full for the first time, it was not Super Saiyan in any numbered sense. It was simply Gohan, completely and without reservation. The Peaceful World Saga was a quiet conclusion to the main Dragon Ball Z story, a denouement rather than a climax set years after the Buu conflict when the world had settled into something like ordinary life and the Z fighters had found their versions of it. Goku was still training. This surprised no one. The world did not particularly need saving at that moment, which meant the 28th World Martial Arts Tournament could proceed as a celebration rather than a preliminary to something worse. At the tournament, Goku encountered a child named Oob, a quiet, earnest boy from a small village who had come to test himself and had found himself in the final round against a fighter he could not have been prepared to face. Oob's power was unusual in ways that became clear through the fight. He had reserves that his evident lack of formal training had not organized into technique, and the reserves were deep in a way that said something about what he was and where he had come from. He was the reincarnation of Kid Buu, born human through Goku's wish at the conclusion of the Buu conflict, carrying the power of the original creature in a form that had been given the choice to develop it according to its own values. Goku offered to train him. He left the tournament with Oob, heading toward his village, toward a period of instruction that would provide the next generation with what they needed, while giving Goku the specific joy that no amount of battle could substitute for. The opportunity to push against something new, something genuine, something that would grow. Dragon Ball GT exists in a separate temporal branch from Dragon Ball Super, a story that was created before Super and that operates in the current official positioning of the franchise as a distinct timeline possibility rather than a continuation of Super's main events. What it represents is a particular attempt to imagine what came next, told with the visual language and emotional architecture of the era that produced it. It is best understood on its own terms, in the specific light of what it was trying to say. 5 years after the Peaceful World Saga, Emperor Pilaf, who had been pursuing Dragon Balls since the very beginning of the Dragon Ball story, in a career of ambition and misadventure that had never once delivered the outcome he was seeking, found the Black Star Dragon Balls. These were the Dragon Balls that Kami had created before splitting the good from the evil within himself, the original spheres, powered by a different and darker energy than the Dragon Balls that Dende had created after Kami's passing, and carrying a condition that their Earth-based successors did not have. Using the Black Star Dragon Balls to grant a wish scattered them across the galaxy rather than across the planet, and if they were not returned to Earth within a year, the planet would be destroyed. Pilaf, who had the Dragon Balls and the Dragon and the Wish, wished for Goku to be a child again. This was not his intended wish. It came out wrong in the way that certain spoken thoughts come out wrong, the mind reaching for one thing and the mouth arriving somewhere adjacent. Goku shrank. The adults around him, who had been children when he had been an adult for the last several decades, were suddenly considerably larger than him, and the visual comedy of this situation was matched by the practical urgency of going into space to find 7 Dragon Balls before a year was up. The journey that sent Goku, Pan, and Trunks across the galaxy in search of the scattered Black Star Dragon Balls was wide in scope and uneven in its individual episodes, carrying within it a particular quality of adventure that recalled the earliest Dragon Ball stories, the sense of a wide, strange universe full of beings and situations that had not been encountered before. Pan navigated. Trunks managed the ship. Goku adapted to his smaller body with the same essential equanimity that he had always brought to whatever circumstances arranged themselves around him. They found Dragon Balls, they encountered threats, overcame them, and continued. The galaxy revealed itself in pieces, a cold planet here, a society of mechanized beings there. A series of encounters that built a texture of the wider universe that the main story, focused primarily on the direct line of escalating power, had not had occasion to show. Goku's power in his reduced body was still considerable. The muscle memory and the ki accumulated over decades had not diminished, and what he had lost in height he retained in every other meaningful dimension. The baby arc brought the Tuffle legacy back to its conclusion. The organism that the dying Tuffle King had launched into space, encoded with the genetic memory and the vengeance drive of an exterminated civilization, had landed, awakened, spread, and grown. Baby had taken control of Vegeta, had used that body as a vehicle to build a new civilization on a planet he called New Plant, had absorbed the power of nearly everyone on Earth by infecting them with his parasitic influence. The confrontation that followed was the kind of confrontation that GT handled with its specific emotional register, the weight of a people's entire extinction being carried forward in one creature, and the question of whether any individual can or should be held personally responsible for a catastrophe that preceded their birth. Goku achieved Super Saiyan 4 during the baby arc, a transformation different in character from the golden Super Saiyan forms, recovering the Saiyan Great Ape power that the divine Super Saiyan God form had superseded in the main timeline. Combining it with the full human consciousness that distinguishes the Super Saiyan transformation from the uncontrolled Uzaru, the result was a red-furred, dark-eyed form that carried both the Great Ape's physical power and Goku's own technique and will. The visual impression of it was unlike any previous form, raw and ancient in a way that connected to the Saiyan racial memory more directly than any number could measure. Baby was defeated. New Plant was evacuated before its destruction. The Earth, separated from its moon by the fight's collateral damage, recovered. Piccolo chose to remain in the underworld at this stage, a decision that carried its own particular weight for those who understood how far he had traveled from the King Piccolo's son, who had once existed only to destroy the warrior who had beaten his father. The Super 17 arc brought the android legacy that had been a recurring presence since the Red Ribbon Army. Back in a final form, Dr. Gero and Dr. Mayu, the second scientist who had been developing the M2 parasite-based machine mutant technology, collaborated in the underworld to create a second Android 17 and merge the two versions, the one from the living world and the one created in Hell, into a combined Super 17 whose power exceeded the original considerably. The resolution required Android 18's unique position in the story, her connection to the original 17, her understanding of what he had been and what had been done to the version she was facing, and her willingness to use that knowledge as the opening that the fight required. The Shadow Dragons were the final arc of Dragon Ball GT, and, in a certain sense, the final arc of the Dragon Ball story as that era understood it. The concept underlying them was elegant in its irony. The Dragon Balls, which had been used throughout the entire Dragon Ball story to solve problems and restore the lost, had a cost. Each wish left a residue of negative energy within the balls. Over the course of decades, over the enormous accumulation of wishes granted, lives restored, catastrophes reversed, desires fulfilled, that residue had built to a saturation point. When the Black Star Dragon Balls shattered, the negative energy was released and took form. 7 shadow dragons, one for each ball, each one a concentrated expression of the darkness that the corresponding wish had generated. Each shadow dragon was different in character and in power, some carrying relatively simple destructive abilities, some carrying the specific dark reflection of whatever wish had given them existence. One born from the wish that had revived the people killed by Vegeta on the day of the Saiyan invasion was enormous and physically overwhelming. Another, born from the wish that had restored Frieza's victims on Namek, had an ice-based power that reflected its origin. Working through them required understanding what each one was made from, a kind of archaeological combat that gave the arc a specific quality of inventory, an accounting of everything the Dragon Balls had done and what it had cost. The final Shadow Dragon was Omega Shenron, the one that had absorbed all 7 Dragon Balls and taken all 7 negative energies into itself, combining the accumulated weight of decades of wishes into a single overwhelming form. The fight was the largest in Dragon Ball GT's scale. Goku and Vegeta achieving Super Saiyan 4 fusion as Gogeta, fighting Omega Shenron with everything that 2 lifetimes of combined training had produced. The fusion broke before the fight could conclude, an instability in the technique rather than any failure of will, and Goku faced the final moments alone, with a spirit bomb whose fuel was the energy of everyone willing to give it. The conclusion of Dragon Ball GT was not an ending in the violent sense, not a battle won and a villain sealed, and a planet saved. It was something quieter. The original Shenron, who appeared after Omega Shenron's defeat to grant one final wish, received a request to restore the Earth. The wish was granted. And then Shenron did something that had not been part of any previous summoning. He absorbed the Dragon Balls, returning them to his own body, and asked Goku to come with him. The departure was calm. Goku said goodbye in the ways available to him, a touch to the back of a friend. A look held for a moment longer than necessary, a small exchange with Vegeta that carried within it the full weight of everything they had been to each other, across decades of rivalry and respect, and the particular kind of affection that neither of them would have named that way. He climbed onto the dragon's back. He left. The Dragon Balls would not return to the world for approximately 100 years. Without the balls, the urgencies that had organized the entire Dragon Ball story had no mechanism for expression. The world continued as worlds do, growing, changing, losing the people who had shaped it, and growing new people who would shape it differently. Pan survived. She became the eldest surviving connection to the era that had passed, the granddaughter of Goku, daughter of Gohan, who had flown in her grandfather's arms as a baby and learned to fight before she could read well. She watched the world change at the pace that long lives allow, carrying what she remembered of the people who were gone, knowing that somewhere in the deeper fabric of things, something with her grandfather's face was still out there. A tournament was organized, the 64th World Martial Arts Tournament, in the era after the Dragon Balls had returned. 2 young competitors entered its brackets carrying names that contained history. Goku Jr., descended from Pan and through her from Goku, arrived with a gentleness that would have been familiar to anyone who had known his ancestor, the same open quality, the same guileless approach to the world, the same reserves of something underneath the surface that had not yet been called on in full. Vegeta Jr., descended from the Saiyan prince, arrived with the same proud posture, the same particular energy of someone who measured everything against a standard that was permanently set very high. They fought. Pan was there, watching from the stands, and in the crowd she saw a figure who carried in his posture and in the specific quality of his presence something that she had been waiting to see for a very long time. She moved through the crowd toward him. He was gone before she reached the place where he had been. The Dragon Ball story, in that moment and that empty space in the crowd, arrived at an ending that was not really an ending, or rather, at a resting point, the kind that stories return to after their circle's complete. Everything that had happened was still true. Everyone who had lived in it had been changed by it. And somewhere, perhaps, the search for the next transformation, the next challenger, the next ordinary morning that contains within it the unexpected beginning of everything, was already underway. To hold the Dragon Ball story in full is to hold something that spans 60 years from the original publication of Akira Toriyama's manga in 1984, something that began as a loose, comedic adventure about a boy with a tail looking for magic spheres and became one of the most expansive fictional mythologies in human creative history. The divine hierarchy, the ancient Saiyan legends, the fighting tournaments that gave structure to a world where power was the primary language, the characters who moved through it all, changed by it, defined by it. Goku remained across every version of the story and every transformation and every impossible circumstance, fundamentally himself. This was perhaps the central thing, not the power levels, not the techniques, not even the transformations that became cultural landmarks. The thing that made Goku Goku was the quality of his attention, the way he looked at every new challenger as a gift, every defeat as information, every meal as a miracle, every friend as the most important thing currently available to him. He was not complicated, and he was not simple. He was honest in a way that was rarer than any transformation and more difficult to maintain under pressure. Vegeta remained, across every arc and every grudging evolution, the prince who had refused to be diminished by any outcome, who had chosen, again and again, to grow rather than stop, to acknowledge what he had been wrong about without pretending the acknowledgement was comfortable, to stand beside the person he had originally arrived to conquer with a respect that his pride had been forced to develop a new vocabulary for expressing. The world that Dragon Ball built was full, in every corner, Namek with its clear water and its grass, the mountains where Grandpa Gohan had raised a child he had found in a strange machine, the sacred world of the Kai, where the Z-sword had stood in its stone for longer than anyone had thought to count, the arena in the void where 80 fighters had stood at the beginning of the Tournament of Power and where the last one standing had wished everyone back. Each of those places carried the weight of what had happened in them. Each had its own texture of light and sound, the specific quality of how the air felt there, what the sky looked like at a particular angle, what it meant to stand in that location and understand that certain things had occurred here that would not occur again. The Dragon Ball universe was large enough to hold all of it, and every piece of it had been worth the attention. Akira Toriyama, who created all of it from the initial sketch of a boy and a monkey and a magical ball, gave the world something that it did not know it needed in exactly the form it arrived. A story about effort, about friendship, about the kind of competitive love that pushes people toward their best possibilities. He gave the world Goku, who remains, across every version and every argument about power levels and canon timelines, one of the most uncomplicated expressions of joy in fictional history. And now, the story rests the adventures that assembled themselves across 60 years of publication and animation and film in the quiet hours of millions of people watching something that made them feel, have been traced from their beginning to their most distant point and set down gently in this late, quiet hour. Perhaps something of the feeling of those stories is present even now, the particular warmth of a world that was always, underneath all its violence and all its transformations and all its impossible power, fundamentally kind. A world where the person who wanted to eat the most food and find the next good fight was also the person most likely to stand between the darkness and anyone who needed protecting, where pride and friendship and grief and joy all occupied the same space without canceling each other out. Rest now. Let the stars of Universe 7 burn gently at whatever distance they have always burned. Let the Dragon Balls sit scattered across whatever planet they currently occupy, waiting with the specific patience of things that know they will eventually be found. Let the people of that story sleep as the people of every story eventually sleep, having done, in their own fashion, everything they could. Thanks for spending this time in the Dragon Ball universe with me. If you'd like to keep drifting, another video is ready on the left of your screen. Maybe let it play as you close your eyes. Sleep might find you before the next story finishes.